Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I'm Michelle Gray, the Director of Programming for the New York Times live conversation series TimesTalks, which pairs New York Times journalists with today's most creative and seminal voices from the fields of film, theater, music, art, science, literature, and politics. President Trump's recent announcement that the United States would withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord was a major setback in the fight against the global climate crisis. Now more than ever, it's up to the people to continue the energy revolution. Tonight, we're honored to be presenting this crucial conversation with former Vice President and climate change activist Al Gore on how far the battle to halt climate change has come and why he thinks the momentum is unstoppable. Former Vice President Gore has become a uniquely post-political figure, pursuing ideas larger than any party or office. In his upcoming film, Inconvenient sequel, Truth to Power, he continues his tireless fight, traveling around the world, training an army of climate champions and influencing international climate policy. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to tonight's moderator, Carl Davenport, the New York Times reporter covering energy and environmental policy, and former Vice President Al Gore.
Thank you. Thank you.
Former Vice President Al Gore, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome you. I'd also like to welcome our Facebook Live audience. If those of you watching online know that we have a Q&A portion coming up later, so you can start writing your questions in the comment section, and we'll get to those once we go to the Q&A. Mr. Vice President, I know that you have a new movie just coming out 10 years after your first one, An Inconvenient Truth.
Yeah.
Now we have an Inconvenient sequel. A lot of things have changed, and some things have very interestingly come back and seem to repeat themselves.
Yeah.
And before we get started, I would love to just take a look at the trailer for the film so
Okay.
the audience can be introduced. If we could play the trailer. One of the things that's so interesting about watching the movie, watching the trailer, is the sense that I got of déjà vu. 20 years ago, in 1997, you went to Kyoto to help forge the world's first climate change treaty, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. You went to Kyoto and you promised the world on the world stage that the U.S. would act, that the U.S. would take steps at home to cut emissions, that the U.S. would be a leader in forging global climate policy. Then you went home, Congress refused to ratify the treaty, and an election completely changed the picture. Your successor, George W. Bush, pulled the U.S. out of the Kyoto Protocol. And in the decade since then, President Obama went back to the world stage. In 2015, he went to Paris and he said, trust me, listen to us. This time the US is fully back. We're going to sign on. We're going to be leaders. We're going to take action. We're going to cut emissions at home, and we're going to move forward this time with an international climate accord. An unexpected election, all of a sudden, an unexpected election outcome led to a Republican president stepping forward and saying, nope, we're pulling out. Here we are. What went through your mind as you saw the announcement from President Trump on June 1st?
Well, that was a good wind-up and a good pitch. There's so many reactions I had to the premises for your question. What went through my mind when President Trump made his speech pulling out of the Paris Agreement was that initially I was quite concerned that other countries might use his announcement as an excuse to pull out themselves. But virtually the entire rest of the world has instead redoubled its commitment to the Paris Agreement. And here in this country, so many governors and mayors and business leaders have said that they are still in the Paris Agreement. The American people would like to see us continue meeting our commitments under the Paris Agreement by very large majorities. The latest projections that I've seen indicate there's an excellent chance that the U.S. will, in fact, meet the commitments made by former President Obama under the Paris Agreement. So if President Trump does less, we have to do more. If he is not going to lead, the American people can.
How has the world changed between then and now? Between the beginning of the Bush administration,
Yeah.
when a president felt politically comfortable pulling out, and today, is it the same scenario? Is it different?
No, there have been many changes compared to 20 years ago, and many changes compared to even 10 years ago. 20 years ago, the role of the developing world in causing the climate crisis was relatively small, and the Kyoto Agreement was designed in recognition of the fact that the advanced industrial countries were almost entirely responsible for the emergence of the climate crisis, and because they had many more resources to deal with it, the only kind of agreement that was possible was one that put the initial burden on the wealthy countries and then called for the developing countries to come in the second stage of it. And that was difficult politically in the Congress, for sure. Today, by contrast, 2/3 of the emissions are from the developing countries. China was a minor player 20 years ago. Now its emissions are, 165% of what the U.S. emissions are. Even on a per capita basis, China exceeds the emissions of the European Union, and on current projections may become the largest historical contributor to the problem. But another thing, many other things have changed. Compared to 10 years ago, the solutions to the climate crisis were clearly visible on the horizon, but you really had to rely on the technology experts to reassure you that yes, they will be here, they're coming, we're quite confident of it. But that's a different proposition than now, when the solutions are here and they are increasingly affordable. If you look at the so-called cost down curves for solar and wind and now batteries and electric vehicles, much less all of the efficiency improvements that don't get as much attention but collectively are even more important. All of these technologies are now becoming mainstream in a growing number of regions. Electricity from renewable sources is actually less than half the cost of electricity from burning fossil fuels. And there's a synergy between the availability of renewable energy and the availability of batteries, because that cost down curve is really getting exciting now. Because now you often have surplus renewable energy at night when the wind is abundant, and you can't keep it for the day. With batteries you can, and you can keep the solar electricity for use at night. So there is an emerging revolutionary transformation of the entire energy sector, which will be accompanied by sharp reductions in emissions. Here in the U.S., the transportation sector has actually become a larger source of emissions than the electricity generation sector, but now we're seeing virtually every auto manufacturer in the world beginning to introduce electric models. India has announced amazingly that within 13 years, all of their cars and trucks will have to be electric vehicles. That's incredible. Volvo just announced last week that they're canceling any new internal combustion engines, hybrids, yes, but mainly EVs for the future. Sustainable agriculture is growing very rapidly. Sustainable forestry with satellite monitoring of forest destruction. These and other advances are clearly bringing to the world the clear opportunity to solve the climate crisis. Now, the other change from even 10 years ago is that the climate-related extreme weather events are way more frequent, way more destructive. We're better prepared for them, but the incidence and the severity have really had a big impact on public opinion. Even people who don't feel comfortable using the phrase global warming or climate change or climate crisis are now saying, wait a minute, this weather is extremely weird. Just in the last 7 years, the U.S. has had 11 once-in-a-thousand-year events. Mother Nature turns out to be a pretty persuasive participant in this discussion.
After the 2016 presidential election, during the transition period in December, the president-elect was spending time here in New York in Trump Tower. A lot of people were coming and meeting with him. So you received a call from Ivanka Trump asking you to come in and meet with President-elect Trump. You came to Trump Tower. You spent, I think, about an hour with the president-elect. What did you talk about? How did your conversations go, both with Ivanka Trump, with the president-elect? What was your sort of feeling when you came out?
Well, that was not the only conversation that I had with President Trump after the election and after his entry into the White House. And I have respected the privacy of the conversations because I just think that's the right thing to do with any president. But the exchanges were mutually respectful and cordial, and I got the feeling that he was open to the persuasion I was attempting, and I actually thought there was a real chance he would come to his senses and stay within the Paris Agreement, but I was wrong.
So you spend a lot of time traveling the world, talking to world leaders, talking to senior diplomats. In the last 6 months, what are you hearing from the people you meet with? You just got back from Australia. What are you hearing from world leaders, from elected officials in other countries about what we're seeing in U.S. climate policy? What do they think about us?
Yeah.
What do they say?
Yeah, what do we think about us right now? It's, wow. I'm trying to choose my words carefully. I did spend 5 days in Australia last week. The week before that, I trained another group of climate activists in Switzerland. And all around the world, friends of the United States are, I would say, in what they communicate to me, I would say they're puzzled and deeply concerned. The United States has been, in many ways, the so-called thought leader of the world, with people from all parts of the world looking to us as a place that embodies many of their greatest hopes and dreams for freedom of expression, freedom of religion, economic freedom to pursue prosperity as they define it. And for more than 2 centuries, we have been a destination for those who dream of a better, freer life. And all of a sudden, it didn't start with Donald Trump. I think that many of them felt it was odd that we invaded a country that didn't attack us in the early 2000s, and that we overturned General Washington's prohibition against the torture of captives. And those were early signs that something had gone badly wrong in our political culture. I think that the way we communicate among ourselves in our democracy is a big part of the problem, but I won't digress to go and explore that cause of the problem. But in answer to your question, I think friends of the U.S. around the world are really deeply concerned that we have that our compass is not aiming at true north anymore, that other forces are pulling the compass needle in odd, confusing directions, and that our democracy is not working the way our founders intended it to. And of course, big money has long since hacked our democracy, and we need to, in order to fix the climate crisis, we have to spend time fixing our democracy crisis. We need to get the influence of big money out of the driver's seat in our democracy. We need to find a way to identify and recognize the propagandistic outlets that pretend to be legitimate journalism sites that confuse people. That this even before the massive Russian effort to distort our election just passed. So I would say they're concerned, and the big majority of Americans are deeply concerned too. We got to fix this. This is not a small thing. We've got work to do. Those of us who are Americans, who are alive right now, have a debt to our founders and to the generations that have made sacrifices throughout American history to hold on to what the American dream is really about and make our democracy work once again the way it's supposed to.
One of the countries that will be crucial in the 21st century climate change story is India. You mentioned the difference between sort of the state of the global economy when the Kyoto Protocol was being forged, and today. Yeah. Back then, developing economies were not the major source of emissions. India is the third largest emitter after China and the United States, but its emissions are projected to climb as much as 3 times or even 7 times over the coming decades. The reason for that is that there are millions of Indians living in poverty without electricity who could gain electricity, enter the middle class, but the cost of that could be a huge increase in emissions. India is going to be such a big part of that story. And you have spent time talking to President Modi and his cabinet about the role that India is playing. And I know that we have a clip of one of those conversations in the movie, if we could play that. So it was India's Energy Minister Piyush Goyal who was pressing you on that. And it's a good question. Why is it fair that the U.S. got to hog all the fossil-fueled growth, and now that they're about to have this economic growth, that they don't get to grow in that way? And part of your answer was this was in the lead-up to the Paris talks. Well, the U.S. is playing its part. The U.S. is, taking a role. That's changed now. Now the U.S. president is saying we're going to roll back our emission standards. We're not going to move ahead with cutting our emissions. So, we're pulling out of the Paris Agreement. And so, Mr. Goyal's question is really resonant. Why is it fair, and why should a developing economy like India have to make changes and sacrifices if the U.S. isn't even doing that now?
Yeah, in some ways it's really easy to understand his point of view, absolutely. And actually in India, there are almost as many people who have no electricity whatsoever as the entire population of the United States. 300 million Indians have no electricity. So yes, it's easy to understand what he is saying. But if we in the United States were in the position India is now, and we were devising a plan to provide electricity to our people for the first time, would we really do it on the basis of coal and build out an electricity grid that now the failures in it cost the economy on average $200 billion a year? the emissions foul our air, but we would leapfrog to the new technologies, of course. And they have the opportunity to do that. Both in India and in China, the co-pollutants, along with CO2, when you burn coal, as you know very well, Carol, it's not only the CO2, it's all the particulates and the other stuff that creates conventional air pollution. India has by far the worst asthma problem in the entire world. The respiratory diseases are horrendous. In northern China, life expectancy has gone down 5.5 years just because of the air pollution. In China, there's an ancient phrase going back at least 2,000 years called the mandate of heaven, and emperors could lose the so-called mandate of heaven. Sometimes if there was a horrendous earthquake or some tragedy that was interpreted as the fact that the gods were against the ruling, the current rulers. And that phrase survives into modern times in China. And they are really concerned that the Communist Party's premier role in China, it could be threatened by public anger and unrest over the pollution in China. Now, India, up until recently, seemed to have a higher public tolerance for high levels of air pollution, but the surge in the last decade of more coal burning, plus the addition of these internet-connected 2.5 parts per million detectors that started with the American embassy in Beijing, and now they're all over China, and they're all over India. And the emerging middle class in India is saying, "Wow, we're supposed to put up with this stuff? It's making our kids sick. We can't recruit the Indian diaspora back to the fast-growing economic centers in India because of the pollution. We need to fix this." And so both China and India have this political incentive to stop polluting so much. It's a serious, serious force there. Now, a second force. I mentioned a moment ago the sharp reduction in the cost of electricity from solar and wind. It's now way below the cost of electricity from coal in India. And they now have been able to get a little, since the Paris Agreement, they have made a U-turn on their policy on energy. They've gotten access to affordable credit from the World Bank, largest loan in history for solar in India. They're building out solar farms in an amazing volume. They've canceled a lot of coal-burning plants. They're shutting coal mines. Same thing is happening in China. China's coal burning has gone down 3 years in a row. This will be the 4th year in a row. And their emissions have gone down an equal number of years. So in the movie, one of the stories in the movie compares this challenge, this technological challenge, to the history of what happened with telephone service. When the first big clunky mobile phones came in, I'm an early adopter, and I got one, and a congressman from New York State, Tom Downey, a really close friend of mine, I used to go over to his house for dinner sometimes in the summer in D.C., and I would call ahead to say, is it okay to you have room for me? Yeah, what time are you going to get it? So I got one of these new phones, and it was so cool. And I went to his doorstep, and I called him and said, "Okay, to come over for dinner tonight?" He said, "Yeah, when will you get here?" Knock, knock, knock. And he opened the door, and it was like that old SNL skit of the Wild and Crazy Guys. Whoa! So at that time, around 1980, AT&T asked one of the big business consulting firms, they've asked me to stop using their name, how many of these things can we sell by the year 2000, 20 years hence? And they did the study, and they came back and said, good news, 900,000. Whoa. So when the year 2000 arrived, they did sell 900,000 in the first 3 days of the year, and 128 times that for the year as a whole. And the reasons were the cost came down extremely quickly, the quality went up simultaneously, and most of the people living in the world of 1980 did not have landline telephone grids, so they leapfrogged. Reason I tell that story, forgive me for going on too long, is that the exact same thing is happening now with solar. Because they have terrible landline electricity grids, and unlike in the US, developing countries don't have a commitment to what we call universal service. Everybody has to be served. No, they run the lines straight to the mines or straight to the big industrial users, and they bypass the villages because they want the big revenue sources. And anyway, so they can leapfrog the old dirty electricity generation system that we have put in place over a long period of time. And it's cleaner and it's better, it creates more jobs, less pollution. It's really a no-brainer. So now there's more to say, but I've gone too long, so I'll go on to your next question.
But your point is that one possibility, at least in India, is as you bring all of these millions of people online to get electricity for the first time, they can potentially do this leapfrog.
And they can do it cheaper and easier by going straight to solar. And that's now what they're doing. It's important to note, Prime Minister Modi, when he was governor of Gujarat State, north of Mumbai in the western part of India, he installed in Gujarat roughly 75% of all the solar panels in the entire nation of India while he was governor. Now, it's small compared to what they're doing now, but he gets this, he understands it. He wrote a little right after An Inconvenient Truth came out, he wrote an online book called An Inconvenient Something, and I can't remember the exact title, but it was good, and it showed that he really got the renewable energy promise, and now he's implementing it.
In the United States, the domestic politics of climate change have become toxic. You look at congressional races and Republican primaries, and it's still a word that can't be said, a term that can't be used. In his first term, President Obama tried to pass a cap and trade bill. After it failed, that policy has been pronounced dead on arrival for at least the next decade. He attempted to push through regulations on coal-fired power plants. President Trump's EPA is now in the process of legally going through the steps to unwind them. They have framed the regulations as job killers, as executive overreach. This whole debate has become so toxic. So what happens next? I mean, where does the climate debate in the U.S. go from here?
Well, first of all, in 2009, President Obama did try to pass it in the House, and he succeeded. It was different when it came to the Senate. The healthcare morass was taking all the attention of the White House. I think we could have passed it in the Senate in 2009, and I think we could have then gone to the climate negotiation in Copenhagen at the end of that year with a much stronger hand. But that's water under the dam. The fact that, well, first of all, the achievement in Paris 18 months ago was really historic. There's never been a successful global treaty like what happened in Paris. And almost 200 nations signed up to it. The exceptions are all, it's not worth going into. I mean, Syria, they can't do anything like that. Nicaragua wasn't strong enough for them, so we're aligned with Syria now. But the agreement was really strong, and it was designed purposely to send a powerful signal to business, to investors, to industry, to civil society. That signal has been received. There has been a sea change all around the world where the commitment to solve the climate crisis is concerned. We're seeing the divestment movement really pick up speed. I mean, you know, we have just as a quick aside, we have about $22 trillion worth of subprime carbon assets in the global economy, consciously referring to the subprime mortgages, which masqueraded as having real value, but were actually worthless. And 2/3 of the energy reserves that are currently marked to market on the books of the multinational oil companies and the sovereign owners can't ever be burned and won't be burned. Not just because of Paris or because of national regulations, but Mother Nature won't allow them to be burned. It cannot happen, will not happen. So at some point, investors are going to realize, wow, we got to get out of this stuff. And they're beginning to do that. The market capitalization of the coal industry has already plummeted almost 90% in the last decade. Coal is, I guess they can detect a faint heartbeat, but it's almost completely gone in the U.S. It's been, and in other countries, it's declining rapidly. Oil is now, it's a fool's errand to predict oil prices. I'm not going to try to do that. But they see the handwriting on the wall. Electric vehicles, cheaper batteries, the liquid petroleum products, they're going to, there was a famous saying from the Saudi Arabian oil minister 30 years ago, the Stone Age didn't end because of a shortage of stones, and the petroleum age will not end because of a shortage of petroleum. So this is directly relevant to your question about where the climate politics go in the U.S. It's not just a matter of what Donald Trump wants to tweet. That doesn't end the discussion. The state governments have a huge role to play. Within the last 24 hours, our largest state, California, has just passed a truly historic state law that extends their statewide cap and trade regime well past 2020. It's a terrific achievement by Governor Jerry Brown, who really is one of my close friend, but I'll call him a hero also. He does an amazing job. Here in this state, Governor Cuomo is committed to the Paris Agreement. Lots of other governors, and they have really more to say about it than the White House does. And if you look at the list of large and small and medium-sized businesses in the U.S. who are telling their customers and their stakeholders and their employees, we are committed to the Paris Agreement. We are going to meet these goals. I'm on the board of Apple. I'm extremely proud that Apple's already gone 100% renewable energy in the U.S., also in China. Soon will be worldwide. Google, you can go, Microsoft, you can go right down the list. And cities. The movie tells the story of one of the most conservative Republican cities in America now achieving 100% renewable energy. The city of Atlanta just pledged to go 100% renewable. You've been to Atlanta. I go to Atlanta a lot. Believe me, if Atlanta can go 100% renewable, any city can go 100% renewable.
You've talked a lot about the business signal, about the dropping price of renewables, about sort of where the coal industry is going. There's something else that has changed in the 20 years since Kyoto and even in the years since the cap and trade bill failed, and that is we're now starting to see direct, attributable, on-the-ground impacts from climate change in the United States. With clear links drawn by major scientific reports. It's less something that is, this kind of apocalyptic disaster in the future, and something that scientists and homeowners and business owners can say, well, that's happening because of climate change, and it's in our backyard. And you have a moment on that in the movie, if we could show it.
Yeah.
So one of the things that is really interesting about the Miami Beach story in particular is that community is singled out in the 2014 National Climate Assessment Report, put together by 14 federal agencies, where the scientists say, they even name some of the streets in Miami Beach, and they say, this flooding that's happening, this isn't just from freak storms, this is high tide coming in higher than it was before. directly attributable to melting ice, melting polar ice sheets. This is a real-time impact of climate change. Why hasn't that changed the debate?
Well, it is changing the debate. The mayor of Miami is a Republican, and he has come out publicly and said, what in the hell does this have to do with politics? This is a threat to my city. A number of Republican members of Congress from Florida have joined the so-called Noah's Ark Caucus, so named because they, well, maybe you think you know the reason for the name, but it's also the fact that they can only join by twos.
Every D has to bring an R?
Yeah, exactly. Republicans and Democrats together. And there are a growing number of Republicans who are looking at their hold cards and saying, whoa, wait a minute, this is real. There's a new book called, I think it's called Farmer, Rancher, Fisherman, something like that. And it's one of many new studies showing how people who are in touch with nature, whether because of their work or some other reason, even if they don't like to use the phrase global warming or climate crisis, they are really tuned into the fact that this is, the changes have to be addressed and dealt with. So I think it is changing the politics. Miami, that day, those days I was there were sunny days. They call it sunny day flooding. There was no rainfall at all. And measured by assets at risk, Miami is the #1 city in the world at risk to sea level rise. What's number 2 is Guangzhou. What's number 3? New York City and Newark, New Jersey. If you measure by, and then you have Galveston, and you have the largest naval base in the world is ours in Norfolk, Hampton Roads. It's going to have to be moved because of sea level rise. Annapolis, a lot of coastal communities. And we focus on our communities. What about these low-lying Pacific islands? One of them has already purchased land to move their entire population. Many more will have to. Bangladesh, 60 million people estimated in the low-lying delta areas that are due to be flooded. This sea level rise is a major, costly threat to civilization. And it's always first manifest in the storm surges and the so-called king tides, the highest tides of the year. And the people that have to move are climate refugees. And India's already built the largest steel fence in the world on its southern border with Bangladesh because of the refugee flows that are already happening. And the refugees, by the way, are also caused by drought. Maybe we'll get into that later, but that's connected to the Syria civil war, which a story that's also told in the movie.
We're getting right to the point where we're going to move to some audience Q&A, and I see that our Facebook viewers, our Facebook participants have already sent in some questions. But before we go there, I have to ask who you like for 2020. For your party.
Oh gosh, I've missed all these horse race questions. What year is it again? It's 2017, isn't it? That didn't help me dodge the question. I hoped it would. I really do think it's way too early. I can tell you who I don't like. By the way, on the Paris Agreement, I meant to make this point. That under the terms of the Paris Agreement, there is a 3-year waiting period for withdrawal. And then there is an additional waiting period when the notifications have to take place. Guess when the first official date for the actual withdrawal from Paris of the U.S. could take place? The day after the 2020 presidential election. And a new president happen before then. You never know. But the tattered remnants of my political advisors will be telling me you shouldn't have said that. But a new president need only give 30 days notice that the U.S. is rejoining the Paris Agreement. So legally, this could be just a small speed bump. But back to your question. I really and truly, I have no idea. I don't have any political analysis. It is early. I'm sure there's some people out there moving around. I have no idea which ones are trying to get the pole position or anything like that. I really don't know.
Okay, I'll go ahead and ask you one more question.
Okay.
It's about both Paris and the election.
Okay.
And for folks in the audience who have questions, we do have mics in the aisles. So if you want to start lining up, we'll go back and forth between the mics, and then we'll also ask the questions from Facebook Live. So as you said, it would be legally possible for the next U.S. president to rejoin, if it's a different president, to rejoin the Paris Agreement. And I anticipate that it could potentially be a significant issue in the campaign.
Yeah.
The rest of the world at that point will have seen this story from the U.S. already twice before. We're going to be leaders. We're going to join. The rest of the world needs to act. Pull out. We're going to be leaders. We're going to join. The rest of the world needs to act. Fool me once, shame on me. What happens if another U.S. president goes back to the world stage and says, we're entering back in and we want to use the moral force of the United States to push all of you to take action? Why should the U.S. have any credibility?
Well, this question highlights, again, some of the profound differences that we have in the world today compared to the world of 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. For the entirety of the post-Cold War period, really the post-World War II period, there has been a relationship between the developed and developing countries that has contributed to a constant demand from the developing countries that if you want us to be a part of any kind of global agreement, you got to give us money and help us do it. And the disappointment of the developing countries in the flows of money they've received is not aimed solely at the U.S. The rich countries as a group have found it increasingly difficult in terms of their domestic politics to have large foreign aid flows. Because in the period of hyper-globalization, there's a centrifugal force flinging many jobs to lower wage venues, and the booming economies in many of the developing countries seem to be gaining so much momentum that politically in the U.S., foreign aid's always been difficult, even more difficult now. One of the profound changes that was evident during the Paris negotiations is that the developing countries appreciated the pledges that were made for the Green Fund, but they have come to a fairly sophisticated understanding that the very large flows of capital they need to continue reducing levels of poverty are going to come mainly from investments in their developing economies. And particularly where renewable energy and the sustainability revolution is concerned, they are now taking the bit in their own teeth and saying, we got to solve this problem. They're feeling the impacts. They have their own reasons for solving it now. So I don't think that, the U.S. leadership is still essential. There's no other country that can lead the world the way the U.S. can. China is going to try, but for all of their advances, they still deny freedom to their people, and I just don't think the world is going to see the prospects of Chinese leadership of the world in the same way they have seen U.S. leadership. So I think that we're going to solve this crisis. It's a big question how quickly we will solve it, and that matters a lot because we're already going to have to adapt and adjust to some unpleasant changes such as sea level rise, and there are unfortunately a number of others. But we still can solve it in the sense that we can avoid the most catastrophic changes. And the world will welcome the return of the U.S. presidency to a leader of the world community whenever that happens. Even now, they still look to U.S. business and industry and investors. And by the way, I mentioned California. California is out there signing agreements with with regional governments, local governments. When I was in Australia, I met with the leaders of the premiers of the four most populous Australian states, and I delivered letters from Governor Brown. Some of them announced while I was there that they're signing up to the agreement with California and Canada and Mexico and I forget how many, but more than 100 other regional jurisdictions around the world. The baton of leadership is now passing in some respects to these regional leaders who are in a position to make bolder, more efficacious decisions than our national government's kind of paralyzed now. Anyway, it's sad, it's pathetic, but maybe I'm hoping we'll get back to good democratic health.
On that note, let's turn to audience questions. So please keep your questions brief and to the point. I'll start on this side, the woman at the mic.
Hi, Mr. Vice President. Risa Levine from New York. When you were Vice President, one of your many signature accomplishments was reducing the size of the government, reinventing government to the tune of, 300,000 jobs. And yet the Clinton-Gore administration put 22 million more people to work and put 100,000 cops on the street and reduced violence to women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, with smaller government. In this talk, you spent a lot of time talking about the innovations of a lot of companies and large and small businesses and what they're doing to address climate change. Are you, to play devil's advocate for a second, because you probably know where my sympathies lie.
Am I what?
To play devil's advocate for 1 second.
Yeah.
Are you making the argument that, could it be perceived that you're making the argument for the people who say that the marketplace will take care of these problems, that government doesn't need to be involved in problems like in addressing climate change, but rather it's a market-based problem, and President Trump was right to withdraw from the Paris Accords?
Very thoughtful question. No, I'm not making that case at all.
What about the people who say you are?
I'm sorry?
The people who say you could be making that argument.
No, well, I'm not. I get the premise of your question and where you're coming from. Thank you for all the nice statistics about what Bill Clinton and I were able to do in the 90s. You said et cetera, et cetera. I was hoping you'd go through but just kidding. The
I was a volunteer on your campaign.
The so-called Reinventing Government initiative, they called it RIGO, that's Gore spelled sideways. That joke used to work. I don't know. Maybe you had to be there. But it was based on some lessons that were learned in part from the best managed private companies. I went out and spent 3 days shadowing a guy named Herb Kelleher, who was the founder and CEO of Southwest Airlines. I spent a lot of time with some other CEOs of companies that have the reputation of really getting it and giving outstanding customer service. We can all feel when we walk into a business that's really, on the case and they get it. And some of the techniques are translatable into public organizations, for sure. And I was raised in a family of true believers in FDR's New Deal. My father and my mother were really passionate in believing that we as Americans can solve any problem working together through the instruments of our free self-government. And that's sort of my orientation also. But I have to say that it was when I got into the innards of the bureaucracy in the executive branch, I sought out some of the so-called old rats in the barn who had been shaking their heads for years at some of the nonsense that goes on. And I learned from them ways to make these public organizations a lot more effective. I could give you a lot of examples, and some of them are funny. All of them illustrate the basic point that I'll just state succinctly. In order to redeem the promise of self-government, we have to reform the barnacle-encrusted bureaucratic problems that often grow up in public organizations, also private organizations. I mean, particularly, like utilities. I mean, you can all tell your own horror stories about big businesses that don't get it and really operate in a terrible way. But I was really proud of the work that we did. But to your philosophical question, we have to be able to rely on our democracy to operate in an honest, responsive way so that we can set the rules of the road, so that corner cutters don't get unfair advantages, so that public goods that can only be provided by government are in fact provided by government. Private companies can't protect the environment on behalf of the vulnerable. The government has to do that. The private sector has not shown any ability to provide a good, accessible, affordable health care for all. I believe, for example, we ought to have a single-payer health care plan. And I could go on, but I think probably, I hope I made my point and defended myself against that mistaken impression.
It's not mine, it's defense.
We've got a question on this side of the aisle.
Thank you, Vice President Gore. I have a question for you about the hearts and minds aspect of this challenge. I think like most people in the room, I'm completely convinced on the technical aspects of winning the global warming fight. But I wonder why we haven't been able to mobilize support around this as a moral issue. And I know you've done some speaking on this.
Yeah.
There was a great book recently by a guy by the name of Alex Evans out of the UK called The Myth Gap, where he essentially says that we are not connecting with some of the fundamental myths that animate human behavior around the world when it comes to climate change. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on how we build a political movement around that.
Yeah, great question. 3 weeks ago, I joined forces with my eldest daughter, Corinna Gore, who runs the Center for Earth Ethics here in this city at Union Theological Seminary, to conduct a climate activist training for a large number of faith leaders from just about every faith tradition. It was a fascinating experience. It was the second annual. I did it a year ago too. And I do agree with you. And I make the case in this movie that the climate movement is, in fact, in the heart of a great tradition, a tradition of all of the great morally based causes that have advanced the prospects for humanity. The abolition movement, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, more recently the gay rights movement. All of them have met with ferocious opposition until they were resolved into a binary choice between right and wrong. And the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously connected the civil rights movement to the Judeo-Christian faith tradition and framed it as a question of morality. Nelson Mandela in South Africa said of the anti-apartheid movement, it's always impossible until it's done. And in all of these previous examples, it has seemed hopeless at moments until it was done. The gay rights movement, if somebody had told me 6 or 7 years ago that in the year 2017, gay marriage would be legal in all 50 states and accepted and celebrated by 2/3 of the American people, I would have said, I hope so, but what have you been smoking? But that happened. The skill of the campaigners was part of it, but it was also because it was resolved into a moral choice. If God created someone a particular way, God could not have intended that person be persecuted for the remainder of his or her lifetime. It's just very simple. And the moral choice embedded in the faux controversy over the climate crisis, it will be the same. Now, we are unique in the world, here in the US. We're unique in being the only country where the conservative political party is devoted to climate denial. Now, in Tennessee, there's an old saying that if you see a turtle on top of a fence post, you can be pretty sure it didn't get there by itself. And these levels of climate denial embedded in the Republican Party did not get there by themselves. You may know the story. There's a great book written by Naomi Oreskes, a historian of science at Harvard, and Mark Conway, called The Merchants of Doubt. The carbon polluters took the playbook from the tobacco companies. When the scientific consensus linked cigarettes to lung cancer and other diseases, the tobacco companies hired actors and dressed them up as doctors and put them on in front of a camera to say, "Hi, I'm a doctor, and you don't have to worry about any health consequence." And the Surgeon General's report came and went, but the television ads, you can Google them, and there are hundreds of them, and it only hurts when you laugh, but 100 million people died unnecessarily. And the carbon polluters have hired the same PR firms. And they're using the same playbook. It is deeply immoral and unethical. They should be held to account. Your Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman, here in the state of New York, is one of the few in the country who is pursuing them to hold them to account. And, there was a legal settlement against the tobacco companies that funded the ads to dispel the myths that had persuaded kids to start smoking. I hope there's a big settlement with the large carbon polluters that helps to set the record straight on the outright lies that they have fed into the minds of too many people. Most people are seeing through it now, and they know that they're trying to pull the wool over their eyes, but they have allies in these anti-statist ideologues who confuse any kind of democratic self-governments with a communist threat or something. I don't know, but often it's just a cat's paw to make sure that the government cannot interfere with the plans of large polluters or impose taxes at a level that the wealthiest and most powerful don't want to see, to avoid any kind of regulations on pharmaceuticals or other products that might pose some harm to people. I'm getting on a soapbox here, and I'm sorry, Carol, but this comes back to what I said earlier. We've got to reclaim our birthright as American citizens to have a democracy that functions the way our founders intended it to do. And the climate deniers are really constantly injecting this poison. The Koch brothers, ExxonMobil every year says it's quit doing it, but then you see their reports at the end of the year and they're still doing it. And it's a major cottage industry out there to hire these pseudo-scientists that put out this nonsense. You can see that I'm relatively calm about it. Anyway, thank you.
So I know that we're running out of time. I know you have to get to screenings of your movie tonight. So we'll take a question from Facebook Live, and then we'll probably just quickly wrap up. What do you think of a national carbon price?
Oh, I've been for a price on carbon for 30 years. In the first book I wrote about this, I proposed a revenue-neutral carbon tax. I'm still for it. Along with others, I said, okay, if the best we can get is a cap-and-trade system, then that's an indirect way to put a price on carbon. I actually think we ought to do both, and regulations. The best policies in the world, in Sweden, for example, they have both. A carbon tax, of course, faces huge political resistance. Cap-and-trade now has been demonized as well, even though its provenance was in the administration of the first President Bush and the Heritage Foundation. As soon as Democrats endorsed it, they flipped and said, no, we're not for it anymore. But either a direct or indirect carbon price is essential to get the economy to work with us instead of against us.
I guess I would just add one addendum, which is what is the political possibility of seeing a national carbon price?
You know, there's a high-profile Republican initiative now that some senior statesmen, I really respect George Shultz, he's part of the group, and they're arguing for it. Art Laffer, who is a friend and neighbor of mine in Nashville, Tennessee, and he was the author of President Reagan's supply-side economics. He's a passionate advocate for a carbon tax, and you can reduce other taxes with the revenue. I'm all for it. I guess I would have to say, Carol, that I don't think the political prospects for it as of now are very promising. And I think that's why often raising taxes turns out to be so politically difficult. People turn to regulations instead. But we ought to have a carbon tax for sure.
All right, on that pragmatic note.
Do we have to end? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Go to the movie. Buy the book. Thank you so much.
I'd love to keep going.